Welcome to the life of an ordinary Victorian, where every day was a battle against hunger, filth, and a society determined to keep you in your place. Forget the grand portraits and polished speeches. The real story is found in the cramped rooms, endless chores, and questionable meals of the majority. Ordinary people lived extraordinary hardships, and once you know, you'll never see the Victorians the same way again. If you enjoy drifting off to history told with humour and bite, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully drowsy disasters. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the strange, harsh and often ridiculous realities of 19th century life. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about falling asleep to tales of soot, survival, and strict respectability. Now dim the lights, get cosy, and slip back into a world where daily life came wrapped in lace, lectures, and a layer of coal dust. You sit down to breakfast and brace for the ceremony, the sacred ritual of who gets fed first. Your husband naturally is served first. Bacon, tea, dignity. He's the one with wages, after all. Then comes the eldest working son, who gets what's left of the bacon's shadow. Next, the younger boys, who are still considered investments. The girls are handed bread. The baby gets a crust. You get what's left stuck to the knife. The tea has been reheated 3 times and now tastes like regret steeped in copper. You sip it slowly, pretending it's not just warm water with ambition. Your bread could be food or it could be structural support. Either way, it squeaks when you chew. But this is a good day. No one's crying, no one's bleeding, and the dog hasn't tried to eat the table leg. Yet. Breakfast is served, just not to you. The breakfast table in a Victorian working-class home wasn't so much a meal as it was a moral lesson served with a side of famine. Victorian society was structured around the male breadwinner model, a charming little hierarchy in which the man earned the money, the man ate the meat, and everyone else was lucky to nibble on the scraps of his economic glory. Ruth Goodman, in her analysis of family life in the 1800s, explains that once the industrial age kicked in, wages shifted, and so did power. Urban jobs for men paid more than rural work ever had. And with that came a clear rule: feed the one who earns. Everyone else can gnaw on admiration. Bread was the staple of every meal, but not the kind you'd find at a farmer's market today with rosemary and a name like Chad. No, Victorian bread was adulterated, often whitened with chalk or alum powder to stretch it further and make it appear clean. Some loaves were bulked up with bone dust, plaster or starch powder. If you were lucky, your bread only pretended to be poisonous. In 1852, a chemist named Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell examined hundreds of bread samples across London. His conclusion? There is perhaps no article of food more extensively adulterated than bread. Yum! If there was meat, which was rare, it went to the man. Not out of cruelty, but economic survival. The one doing the hardest labour got the calories, and in a family trying to scrape together a living, this meant a sharp divide in food distribution. The man got bacon, the children got gruel, the mother got resentful. This wasn't just anecdotal. In the Lancet's 1851 Commission on Food, investigators noted that, in families of the labouring poor, the man may consume meat daily, the wife and children rarely. By 1880, it wasn't unusual for working boys aged 11 or 12 to be making more than their mothers. When that happened, breakfast order changed again. The boy moved up the bacon ladder. The mother, she moved to scraping pans and pretending lard was a condiment. But let's not pretend it was all bad. Sometimes there were potatoes, sometimes even porridge, but mostly there was bread, and sometimes that bread bit back. In one London case from 1862, a family brought a loaf to court after they bit into it and found a chunk of iron baked inside. The baker was fined 40 shillings. The family kept the iron, possibly for dinner. Tea was the only comfort, and even that was suspect. Lower-income families often reused leaves multiple times, or substituted dried blackthorn leaves, sold fraudulently as cheap blends. In short, if your breakfast didn't kill you, you were doing quite well. Still, people survived. They blessed their crusts, they sipped their sadness, and they started their day. because complaining wouldn't change anything. But working all day on bread and boiled regret, that was just the British way. Now wipe the soot off your fingers and it's time to go earn that next slice of chalk-dusted bread. Let's step outside. You step outside to start your day and immediately gag on the air. It smells like someone boiled a privy, stirred in some feet, and let it simmer on the sidewalk. You sidestep a puddle that's either rainwater or someone's bathroom, probably both. A dead rat floats past, looking more composed than you feel. The alley behind your house is a symphony of fluids, most of them unidentifiable. Somewhere nearby, a child is crying because he just dropped his only slice of bread into a pile of something steaming and alive. The neighbour's toilet is a wooden box over a hole. Your family shares one with 6 other households, and by shares you mean competes. It's a race against time, biology, and whoever remembered the bucket. Last week, the cesspit overflowed. Again. You just kicked some straw over it and pretended the smell was character. Sanitation in Victorian cities wasn't a system, it was a dare. By the mid-1800s, British cities were packed to bursting with people, horses, coal smoke, and disease, all coexisting in an aromatic stew of urban misery. Most working-class homes lacked running water or plumbing. Toilets, if they existed at all, were outdoor privy pits, sometimes shared between 20 or more people. These were rarely emptied until they literally overflowed. The contents, politely called night soil, had to be manually scooped out by nightmen, who worked in darkness because daylight would have made it illegal. One 1858 sanitation report noted, the depth of accumulation was such that the men stood ankle-deep in filth with the liquid matter splashing about them. Good morning. The lucky few had chamber pots which were dumped into the street or alley. Rain was expected to handle the rest. It did not. Instead, it relocated the problem, usually downhill and directly into drinking water. The result? A cholera parade. In the early 1830s, cholera tore through London like a very angry letter from God. It came back in 1848, and again in 1853 and 1866. Each time, officials were baffled, until Dr. John Snow, not the one from the wall, connected it to a single contaminated water pump in Soho. He removed the handle, the deaths dropped. Science. But even after Snow's discovery, many clung to the idea of miasma, the belief that bad smells, not bacteria, caused disease, so they kept cleaning the air instead of the water, hence the 1858 event known as the Great Stink, when the Thames became so foul that Parliament had to soak its curtains in chloride of lime just to keep from vomiting through legislation. According to the Times, the intense heat had driven every particle of filth to the surface, and the whole river was a single seething mass of putrefaction. In response, engineer Joseph Basil Gett was finally commissioned to build a massive sewer system beneath London, over 1,300 miles of pipes, completed in 1875. It was magnificent, it was late, and it didn't reach the slums. Out in Manchester, Leeds, and other industrial cities, many homes still emptied directly into open ditches. Children played nearby. People drank from wells. Babies died. And the newspapers reported it all in grim detail. In one cellar, I found a pool of stagnant filth with a mattress floating on top. The family sleeps there still. Sanitary Report, Liverpool, 1864. And yet somehow life went on. People accepted the smell. They stepped over the rot. They dodged the diarrhea. They covered the privy with a curtain and called it privacy. Because if the breakfast didn't kill you, the street might. Now hold your breath. It's time to get to work. You wake up before the sun because the sun has standards. You do not. It's time for work. That magical place where dreams go to suffocate in coal dust. You put on your finest rags, which used to be pants, and head out the door with a piece of bread so thin it qualifies as a rumour. The streets are already busy. Children are running to factories. Men are coughing up their pensions, and someone just slipped in something that may or may not have been human. The smell is legally considered assault. If you're lucky, you'll spend the next 14 hours inhaling soot next to a machine that's actively trying to kill you. If you're not, you'll be ankle deep in something wet, warm, and definitely not soup. The factory whistle screams, so do you, internally. And just like that, another glamorous day of Victorian labour begins, because nothing says progress like working until your organs mutiny. Victorian work was less about career fulfilment and more about survival, like trying to outrun a lion with a sprained ankle and a hangover. The majority of Britain's working-class population laboured in factories, mines, fields, or as domestic servants, and the unifying theme across all these jobs was that they were absolutely terrible. In cities, factories ran 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Workers faced unsafe conditions, no health protections, and charming little hazards like unshielded gears, lack of ventilation, occasional explosions. In 1833, a parliamentary committee interviewed factory workers. One woman testified, "If we were 5 minutes late, we were beaten with a strap. If we spoke, we were beaten. If we coughed, we were told to do it quieter." In rural areas, labourers were paid by the season, or not at all if the landowner felt moody. In 1844, a poor law commissioner noted, "Agricultural labourers are the worst fed and worst housed class in the British Empire. Delightful." Children as young as 5 worked alongside adults. The textile industry alone employed hundreds of thousands under age 12, their tiny hands ideal for clearing lint from spinning machines that didn't stop spinning. If they lost a finger, there was usually another child to replace them. One mill owner, when asked about this practice, replied, "They're fast and they don't argue. Most haven't learned how." In coal mines, children carried loads called corves through pitch-black tunnels, crawling on hands and knees for hours. Girls in particular worked as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in total darkness. A government report from 1842 stated, "The children appear half-starved, clothed in rags, with faces blackened and legs bleeding from their labour. Wages varied wildly, but all shared one trait. Not enough. Men might earn a shilling or two a day. Women earned less. Children earned even less than that. But families needed every penny, so everyone worked, and hoped the bread that night didn't include sawdust. And yet, amidst the soot, the burns, and the back-breaking hours, workers endured. They formed early unions, they held strikes, they demanded more, or at least slightly less suffering. Progress was slow. Reforms like the Factory Acts eventually reduced working hours and banned child labour under age 9, but enforcement was spotty. Until then, you worked, or you starved. That was the equation. Now shake the coal dust out of your clothes, it's time to go home, which tragically is still worse than work. You come home from work and squeeze into the single room your entire family calls home. It's smaller than a modern bathroom, costs more than it should, and smells like the combined effort of everyone who's ever lived in it. The fireplace is smoking, the walls are damp, and there's condensation dripping down the window, if you even have a window. More likely, it's been stuffed with rags to keep out the draft. Your family is all here, your spouse, your children, maybe a lodger who pays a few pennies to sleep in the corner. There's no privacy, not even the idea of privacy. If someone sneezes, everyone gets wet. The floor creaks, the ceiling leaks, and the bed has at least 3 people in it already. Tonight you'll sleep sideways, top to tail, or not at all. And yet, this is home. You even pay rent for it, which might be the funniest part of all. Victorian housing was less about comfort and more about not freezing to death while upright. For the working classes, especially in booming cities like London, Manchester and Leeds, a home typically meant a single room rented at exorbitant rates. According to 19th century housing reports, families of 6 to 12 people were routinely crammed into 10 by 10 foot rooms, with no running water, no toilet, and absolutely no hope. One 1849 report from the Morning Chronicle described a family of 9 living, sleeping and cooking in a room so small, the ceiling sloped in such a way that only one corner could accommodate a bed. The rest slept on the floor in shifts or upright against a wall if there was one that hadn't rotted. Shared housing was common. Multiple families might live in one building, each family taking a single room. Entire buildings were sometimes subdivided into rookeries, the term used for overcrowded slum tenements that bred disease and despair in equal measure. The worst rooms were windowless, airless, and smelled like human marinade. They flooded when it rained and grew mould when it didn't, and you paid for this privilege, often more, proportionally, than a wealthy family paid for an entire house. Water came from a public pump, if you were lucky, or from a ditch shared with livestock, if you were not. Buckets were used for washing, cooking, and also for not talking about what else they were used for. Toilets, a shared outdoor privy, possibly half a street away and often full. One inspector noted, "The privy was without door or seat, the contents visible from the street and the stench enough to drive a man mad." Sounds cosy, and yet landlords profited. Developers tossed up rows of cheaply built houses with little more than bricks, sludge and hope. Ventilation was rare, drainage non-existent, safety features, only if you count praying. Some families took in lodgers to help cover rent, often unrelated single men, which made for delightful domestic scenarios involving zero space, zero privacy, and occasionally zero children by morning. And in true Victorian fashion, middle and upper-class reformers wrote long, hand-wringing essays about the poor, while doing very little to help them. Still, investigative journalists and clergymen occasionally dared to visit. Reverend Andrew Mearns in 1883 described rooms so damp that mushrooms grew from the walls and children coughed up blood before their 5th birthday. But the rent still came due, and people still paid it, because what else could they do? Home wasn't safe, it wasn't clean, it wasn't even yours. But it had a roof, and that was more than some had. Now lay down in your corner, listen to the sound of 5 people snoring and one suspicious drip from above, and try not to think about where you left your shoes. Morning comes early, and you'll need your strength. It's time to raise children in this circus. You wake up your children for school, just kidding. You wake them up for work. Your 6-year-old ties on his boots, grabs his bread crust and heads off to the mill like a tiny coughing adult. He earns more than his mother, less than his father, and just enough to keep everyone in tea leaves that have already been boiled twice. The 9-year-old goes down into the mines, crawling through tunnels too small for grown men, dragging coal like a human wheelbarrow. He'll come home covered in soot and half a foot shorter from crouching all day, but hey, at least he's contributing. The youngest, barely old enough to spell his own name, is sent up a chimney. It's hot, it's filthy, and if he gets stuck, you're out one child and probably still owe rent. You wave them all off proudly. They may be children, but in the Victorian economy, childhood is a luxury nobody can afford. Childhood in the Victorian era was short, brutal, and usually spent at work. By 1850, nearly half of Britain's textile workers were under 18, many as young as 5. Factories valued small bodies. Children could slip under machines, crawl into tight spaces, and had fingers nimble enough to tie threads mid-production. They were also cheap. A child's wage was a fraction of an adult's, making them irresistible to employers. Coal mines were no better. Children worked as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in pitch-black tunnels for 12 hours at a stretch. Others hauled heavy coal carts, dragging them on all fours with a chain strapped around their waists. A parliamentary report in 1842 noted, "Children appear half naked, covered in grime, their limbs bruised from dragging coal. Many cannot stand upright from the posture their work requires lovely." Then there were chimney sweeps. Boys as young as 4 were sent up narrow flues, often naked to avoid getting stuck. Many suffered from burns, suffocation, or the charming disease soot-wart, a cancer caused by, well, constant exposure to soot. Street jobs were common too. Children sold matches, flowers, newspapers, or swept manure from crossings for pennies. Their earnings often meant the difference between a family eating or not. Parents didn't do this because they were cruel. They did it because the Victorian economy demanded every pair of hands, no matter how tiny. As historian Ruth Goodman put it, once a boy reached 11, he often out-earned his mother. At that point his housework stopped and his bacon portions increased. Reforms came slowly. The Factory Act of 1833 banned employment of children under 9 in textile mills, and limited those aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours a day. But enforcement was weak, and plenty of industries like mines and chimney sweeping ignored the rules entirely. By the end of the century, education laws gradually pushed children into classrooms instead of coal pits. But for most of Victoria's reign, work was their reality. So yes, Victorian children worked hard. Harder than most modern adults, in fact. And the reward? A loaf of adulterated bread, a cough that never went away, and the vague promise of maybe reaching adulthood. Now tuck your kids back into their shared straw mattress. They'll need their rest. Tomorrow, the factory whistle blows at dawn, and besides, it is your turn to go to the privy. You drag yourself home from work and step into the family residence, also known as 1 room, 8 people, and a smell that could apply for citizenship. Dinner follows the sacred Victorian order. Father first, eldest working son second, younger boys third, the girls somewhere near last, and mother dead last, armed with nothing but crumbs and patience. The logic is simple. Whoever earns the most gets the most. Everyone else gets bread, sometimes even toasted bread if the fire hasn't gone out. Conversation is minimal. Talking wastes energy. And besides, it's hard to make small talk when you're chewing bread so dense it could be used as insulation. The boys are excused the moment they swallow. Being wage earners, they are far too important for dishes. The girls stay behind to scrub, sew, and practice being exhausted for the rest of their lives. By bedtime, you're all wedged together on mattresses that crunch like straw and cough like tuberculosis. Privacy doesn't exist. The only curtain in the house covers the draft, not your dignity. And yet this is home. Rent paid, fire smouldering. Everyone still alive. Which, in Victorian England, practically qualifies as luxury. The Victorian family was a finely tuned machine of inequality, and the gears always turned in the same direction, toward the man of the house. Before the Victorian era, men and women often worked side by side, on farms, in trades, or in cottage industries. But industrialisation separated work from home, sending men to factories while women stayed behind. The result was the so-called male breadwinner model. Wages reflected this shift. Men's pay rose in industrial jobs while women stayed pitifully low. The logic was simple. Men earned more, so they were fed more. Historian Ruth Goodman notes that in many working-class families, the best food automatically went to the man, with women and children surviving on bread and tea. One social investigator in 1851 reported, "A father sat to dinner with a chop before him, while his wife and 5 children ate bread only." This wasn't seen as cruelty, it was seen as economic necessity. Keep the man strong, and the wages would keep coming. Children carried weight in the family economy too. By the time a boy turned 11, his wages often outstripped his mother's. At that point, he stopped doing housework entirely, earning him both extra bacon and eternal bragging rights. Autobiographies from Victorian men often recall the moment they first earned more than their mothers, and the freedom it gave them from ever washing a dish again. Girls, on the other hand, were trained early in domestic labour. By age 5, they were helping with cleaning, childcare, and food preparation. By age 9, many were effectively second mothers, taking over much of the household burden so their actual mother could work outside when needed. Privacy and family life was non-existent. In overcrowded housing, a family of 8 might live in a single room. Multiple families often shared one building, with thin walls, if any, separating them. Reverend Joseph Ritson, writing in the 1890s, reported, "Of the 700 families in my London parish, 500 were living in a single room each. Add in a lodger, a common way to make rent. And the Victorian home became a space where every cough, every sneeze, and every argument was shared." Middle-class families lived differently, but not necessarily better. Their homes were larger, darker, and decorated like a furniture warehouse exploded. Heavy curtains blocked light, gas lamps smoked up the walls, and every surface was covered in fussy ornaments designed to prove respectability. The middle-class wife's main job? Shopping. To keep the household running, and to perform the great Victorian ritual of demonstrating moral superiority by buying the right kind of candles. But whether in a slum or a mahogany-filled townhouse, the rules were the same. Men earned, men ate, women worked, women endured. And the children? Well, if they weren't at the mill, they were at the table, waiting for their turn at the bread crust. Now blow out the gas lamp, wedge yourself between two coughing siblings and get some rest. Tomorrow, there's romance in the air, or at least courtship Victorian style, which is roughly the same thing but with more chaperones. You're ready to fall in love, which means you're ready for the most supervised fun you'll ever not have. Step 1, meet your potential spouse. Not at a bar, not on a walk, and definitely not alone. No, you meet in a parlour, under the heavy gaze of her parents, her siblings, and possibly a portrait of Queen Victoria judging you from the wall. Step 2, pretend you're interested in polite conversation while desperately trying not to look directly at her ankles. That's basically second base. Step 3, repeat this performance dozens of times at picnics, teas, and garden strolls, always with a chaperone hovering close enough to hear if you accidentally laugh too loudly. Passion must never interfere with propriety. If you survive this long enough, you win the grand prize, a wife, a dowry, and the lifelong right to sit at the head of the breakfast table while she eats bread dust. Victorian romance, where true love means being allowed to eventually hold hands. Victorian courtship was less about passion and more about property. Middle-class and upper-class marriages were essentially business deals, carefully arranged to secure financial stability, family respectability, and maybe, just maybe, compatibility. Parental involvement was heavy. A young woman's reputation was fragile. One unsupervised stroll with the wrong man could ruin her marriage prospects forever. As the Illustrated London News put it in 1863, a girl's virtue is her only fortune, and once lost, it is never regained. Translation: women were investments, and fathers weren't about to let those investments wander unsupervised. Courtship rituals reflected this paranoia. Young couples could meet at church socials, public lectures, or dances, but always with eyes on them. Even love letters were carefully written to avoid scandal. In some households, they were read aloud by parents before being delivered. Engagements were taken seriously. Breaking one off could lead to lawsuits for breach of promise, with jilted women suing former fiancés for damages to their reputations. Newspapers eagerly reported these cases, delighting readers with tales of broken hearts and ruined prospects. Working-class courtship looked different. Without property or dowries to negotiate, young men and women met more freely, in pubs, at markets, at street fairs. But the same social rules applied. Respectability mattered. A factory girl seen walking out with too many young men could find herself branded with a ruined reputation faster than you could say, cheap gin. Marriage itself was considered the cornerstone of respectability. The law required a ceremony, usually in the Church of England, and records were meticulously kept. Divorce was rare and scandalous until reforms in the late 19th century made it slightly easier. For most couples, till death do us part wasn't just a vow, it was the only available option. But within all the rules, rituals, and restrictions, real affection sometimes thrived. Couples exchanged keepsakes, met in stolen moments, and even, scandalously, kissed before marriage. Many accounts survive of deeply affectionate partnerships that grew despite society's obsession with propriety. In the end, Victorian courtship was less about falling in love and more about managing it respectably. Now adjust your cravat, practice your small talk, and prepare to impress the in-laws. Tomorrow we'll need to discuss what happens once the honeymoon ends, and the babies start arriving. You're married now, which means congratulations, you're about to start a family. Not because you planned it, not because you wanted it, simply because nobody in Victorian England has figured out how to stop it. Within a year, you're holding a baby. Within 2 years, you're holding another baby while still holding the first baby. By year 5, you've forgotten how many you have. There's always one crying, one coughing, and one suspiciously quiet. Children arrive so often they might as well come with serial numbers. You name half of them after their father, the other half after whatever saint you hope will stop the next one from dying of typhus. And while you're knee-deep in diapers, your husband is bragging at the pub about his large family, as though he personally manufactured every single one without your active participation. There's no birth control on the table, or in the cupboard, or anywhere really. The only family planning you can count on is tuberculosis. Welcome to Victorian parenthood. It's less bundle of joy, more bundle of inevitability. The Victorian era produced big families, especially among the working class. Census records show households with 6, 8, even 10 children crammed into a single room. High child mortality meant parents often had more in hopes that some would survive. Contraception existed, technically, but it was controversial, hidden, and largely unavailable to the poor. Middle-class families quietly began limiting family size in the late 1800s, while working-class families continued to have large broods. Rubber condoms appeared after Charles Goodyear's process of vulcanization in 1844, made them cheaper and more durable. Before that, they were made of sheep gut, tied on with ribbons, and about as romantic as they sound. There were also devices like cervical caps and syringes for douching, but these required money, privacy, and the boldness to actually purchase them, which was difficult since in 1857 Britain passed the Obscene Publications Act, banning the distribution of contraceptive information. Pamphlets and manuals were destroyed, and reformers who tried to educate the working poor were often prosecuted. Doctors quietly practiced birth control themselves, while refusing to share advice with patients. As one medical writer explained, "It is the husband's duty to preserve his wife's health by limiting childbirth." Translation: wealthy men had options, poor men had excuses. Meanwhile, women turned to whatever folk remedies they could find. Some used herbal abortifacients, others relied on withdrawal, notoriously unreliable. Many simply carried on having child after child until their health collapsed. Middle-class families, however, clearly reduced their size by the 1880s. Census comparisons show a marked drop in children among professional households. In working-class homes, the drop didn't arrive until decades later. The result was a society where children were everywhere, in mills, in mines, in the streets, in school, if they were lucky. Babies were expected, constant and rarely quiet. As one newspaper quipped in 1873, "The Englishman glories in his numerous offspring, while his wife faints beneath them." So yes, marriage in Victorian Britain meant children. Not a child, not a few children. Children in the plural, until your house was bursting, your body was broken, and your neighbours wondered if you'd started your own factory. Now tuck in the latest edition, pray the midwife returns for the next one, and get some rest. Tomorrow you'll wake up surrounded by coughs, cries, and complaints, and that's just from your husband. You wake before dawn because apparently sleep is for people with money. The fire is out, the water bucket is empty, and the floor is somehow dirtier than when you scrubbed it yesterday. Congratulations, you live in a house that manufactures filth. The day begins with hauling coal, fetching water, and boiling something that looks like food but tastes like boiled disappointment. Breakfast is served in the proper order: husband first, children second, and you last, because nothing says angel of the house like cold bread crusts. Then comes laundry, the most Victorian of tortures. You drag in buckets, heat them over the fire, stir clothes with a stick like some tragic witch, and end up with cracked hands that sting every time you blink at them. By the time the sheets are hung to dry, they're already covered in soot again. Efficiency. Once that's finished, you get to scrub, sweep, mend, and repeat. Your title is housewife, but let's be honest, you're basically running a one-woman factory with worse hours and no wages, and at the end of it all, you still smile politely when someone calls you the angel of the house, because apparently overworked domestic mule didn't catch on. For Victorian women, domestic work was relentless. Middle-class reformers liked to call women the angels of the house, but in practice most women were angels with chilblains, scrubbing floors until their knees gave out. Working-class wives often took on paid jobs as well, in laundries, as charwomen, or doing piecework sewing at home. But the house still demanded full attention. In overcrowded housing, chores multiplied. More bodies meant more dirt, more laundry, more mouths to feed. Food preparation alone could take hours. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Bread had to be bought daily or baked from scratch. Fuel was costly, so stoves were used sparingly. Many meals were little more than boiled potatoes or cabbage stretched with bread. Laundry was particularly grueling. A single wash involved fetching water, heating it in a copper boiler, scrubbing each item by hand, rinsing, wringing, and drying on lines strung indoors or out. The Lancet Sanitary Commission of 1865 described the toll. The laundress's hands are perpetually red, cracked and raw from lye and boiling water. Middle-class wives had a different experience. Not less work, but different kinds of work. Their job was to manage servants, maintain respectability, and keep the household's social calendar in motion. The pressure was immense. The state of a middle-class home was considered a direct reflection of a woman's moral worth. As one etiquette manual advised, the true lady governs her household as a queen her realm, ensuring order, cleanliness, and propriety in all things. Translation: if the curtains were dusty, it was her fault. Even in wealthier homes, the wife was expected to run a tight domestic ship. From planning meals to supervising children's education, her labour was invisible but constant. Across all classes, the message was the same. Women's work was endless, undervalued, and expected. They were responsible for everyone's survival, yet rarely credited for it. And after a full day of housework, many women still turned to sewing, laundry, or other side hustles to supplement the family income. One London report from 1871 noted, "Mothers rise at 4 to complete the washing before their day's labour begins, continuing late into the night with needlework." Exhaustion wasn't an exception, it was the baseline. So yes, Victorian women were angels of the house, angels who cooked, scrubbed, mended, fetched, boiled, hauled and collapsed. Now lay out tomorrow's clothes, refill the coal scuttle and get some rest. Tomorrow brings more of the same, unless of course there's a crisis. And in Victorian homes there's always a crisis. You wake in the middle of the night to the soothing sounds of your entire family coughing in harmony. It's like a symphony, except every instrument is tuberculosis. The baby's feverish, your husband's hacking up coal dust, and your neighbour just died 2 doors down. Which is convenient because you'll probably inherit his bed space. There's no doctor coming. Unless you can afford the fee, in which case he'll show up, tell you you're dying, and charge you for the privilege. If you can't pay, there's always the local quack with a cure made of gin, leeches and optimism. And if none of that works, don't worry, death comes to you. Usually right here in your overcrowded, unventilated, sewage-adjacent home. Illness was a constant companion in Victorian households. Overcrowding, poor sanitation and malnutrition made the working-class home a breeding ground for disease. The big killers included cholera, typhus, smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis. Epidemics swept through cities with grim regularity. In London's 1849 cholera outbreak, over 14,000 people died in just a few months. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, was so common it was practically background noise. Entire families were ravaged by it. A doctor writing in the Lancet in 1861 observed, "The cough of the factory hand is as constant as the din of his loom." Infant mortality was staggering. In some urban districts, nearly 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday. Reports from Manchester in the 1850s described infants left alone while mothers worked, often smothered in overcrowded beds or dying from contaminated milk. Funerals became routine. Undertakers thrived, selling cheap coffins by the dozen. Mourning was an industry, and families often went into debt to afford even a modest burial. In 1852, the Times noted dryly, "The trade of death flourishes where the trade of life barely sustains." Medical care was patchy. Wealthier families could call doctors, though treatments range from mercury pills to bleeding to rest cures that mostly made patients worse. The poor relied on charity hospitals or self-medication. Home remedies included vinegar compresses, herbal teas, or gin. Lots of gin. Despite grim realities, communities showed resilience. Neighbours cared for each other's sick, shared food, or took in orphan children. But the shadow of disease was ever present. Every cough, every fever, every rash could spiral into catastrophe. Death itself was less hidden than today. Bodies were kept in the home for days before burial, laid out in the same room where children played and meals were cooked. For the Victorians, Mortality wasn't abstract. It lived with them, literally in the next bed. So yes, you could survive the bread, the factory and the rent collector, only to be taken out by a single glass of bad water. Now stoke the fire, check on the feverish baby, and hope tomorrow brings something other than a funeral. Because in Victorian England, odds are it won't. You've finally done it, you're broke. Which means it's time for the Victorian workhouse, the one-stop shop for free food, free labour, and a complete loss of dignity. The welcome package includes a head shave, a uniform that makes potato sacks look fashionable, and immediate separation from your family. Because nothing solves poverty like ripping children away from their parents. Meals are served on schedule, thin gruel, stale bread, and on rare occasions, something resembling meat. Though only if you don't ask what kind of meat. Spoiler, you don't want to know. Daily activities include picking oakum, that's fancy talk for unravelling old ropes until your fingers bleed, scrubbing floors that were already clean, and wishing you'd just starved outside instead. At night you retire to the dormitory, a cosy arrangement of 50 strangers in one room, coughing in harmony like the world's saddest choir. Privacy doesn't exist. Hope doesn't either. Welcome to welfare, Victorian style. It's not here to help you. It's here to make sure you never ask for help again. The workhouse system was formalised under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, designed to discourage dependence on public relief. The guiding principle was less eligibility. Conditions inside had to be worse than the lowest paid job outside, ensuring that only the truly desperate would enter. And desperate they were. By the mid-19th century, tens of thousands of families relied on workhouses for survival. Reports describe appalling overcrowding, with the sick housed alongside the dying, and children raised in bleak institutions that prepared them for little beyond more poverty. One inspector in 1841 noted, "Infants lie in cots, 4 to a bed, their cries mingling with the groans of the aged." Food was deliberately unappealing. The notorious workhouse gruel became shorthand for cruelty, thanks in part to Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, 1837. In some institutions, meals were weighed to the ounce and any surplus confiscated. A standard adult diet might be 5 ounces of bread for breakfast, watery broth for lunch, and boiled potatoes for dinner. Punishments were frequent. Inmates who broke rules could be confined in isolation cells, denied food, or forced into even harsher labour. Children were beaten for misbehaviour, while adults faced humiliation and rigid discipline. Public opinion was divided. Reformers argued the system was necessary to instill discipline among the poor, while critics described workhouses as prisons for the innocent. Newspapers covered scandals of cruelty and neglect, with the Times reporting in 1846. A child of 6 was left to waste away from neglect, her cries unanswered in the ward. Over time, reforms improved conditions somewhat, especially after public scandals forced inspections. But the stigma remained. Entering the workhouse was considered shameful, a public admission of failure. Many families delayed it until starvation left them no choice, and so the workhouse became one of the most enduring symbols of Victorian Britain, a place where poverty was punished, dignity was stripped away, and survival came at the cost of freedom. Now close your eyes in your drafty dormitory, dream of fresh bread you'll never taste, and prepare for another day of picking apart rope. Because in the Victorian workhouse, tomorrow is always just yesterday, with more blisters. It's Saturday night and you're off to enjoy your hard-earned leisure time, all 3 hours of it before exhaustion knocks you out cold. If you've got a penny, you might head to the pub. It's warm, it's noisy, and for the price of weak beer you can sit by the fire and pretend you're not slowly falling apart. Entire families come along, because nothing says wholesome bonding like watching Dad drink the rent money while the kids sip ginger beer and learn new swear words. If you've got 2 pennies, you might treat yourself to the music hall, comedians telling jokes about their mother-in-law, singers belting out songs everyone already knows, and maybe a trained dog doing tricks. This is the Victorian version of Netflix, except with more heckling and fewer plot twists. And if you're flat broke, no problem. The streets themselves are entertainment. Punch and Judy puppets beat each other senseless. Organ grinders play the same tune until you want to strangle them, and acrobats risk their necks for a handful of coins, is not glamorous, but it's free, unless you get pickpocketed. This is leisure time in Victorian England. Short, loud, and mostly designed to make you forget you have to get up for work again on Monday. Leisure for the Victorian working class was rare, but vital. The Saturday half-holiday, granted by law in the mid-19th century, gave workers a sliver of free time after 6 straight days of labour. For many, the pub was the social hub. Cheap, warm and communal, it offered not just drink but companionship and news sharing. Reformers hated it, calling pubs dens of vice, but to working-class families they were living rooms with alcohol. Music halls grew rapidly from the 1850s onward, offering variety acts at prices most workers could afford. They became hugely popular, with stars like Mary Lloyd drawing packed houses. Songs often poked fun at daily struggles, turning hardship into humour. For those with no spare money, street entertainment filled the gap. Penny gaffs, makeshift theatres, ballad singers, jugglers, and puppet shows provided noisy distractions. Children especially loved Punch and Judy shows, which mixed slapstick violence with dark comedy, reflecting the rough humour of everyday life. Theatres and concerts catered more to the middle and upper classes, but even here boundaries blurred. The rise of cheap penny papers and serialised fiction brought cultural life into working-class homes. By the 1880s, reading penny dreadfuls, lurid tales of crime and adventure, was a favourite pastime for young people. Not all leisure was entertainment. Sunday remained a day for church, which was both religious obligation and social gathering. For many families, it was also the only day they ate a substantial meal, the fabled Sunday roast, if they could afford it. Reformers and moralists tried to push more improving pastimes, lectures, libraries, museums. Some workers embraced them, others preferred a pint and a sing-along. Either way, leisure offered a chance to escape the grind, however briefly. As one observer in 1874 noted, "The working man's laugh in the music hall is the only medicine he can afford." So yes, leisure was short, simple, and rarely respectable, but it was also survival. Now finish your pint, applaud the performing dog, and head home before the constable decides to break up the fun. Tomorrow it's back to the coughs, the coal, and the chaos. It's market day, and you're armed with the grand sum of 1 penny, which in Victorian England makes you either a valued customer or a walking punchline. The bread stall looks promising. Loaves piled high, shining white, soft as clouds, which is suspicious because real flour doesn't look like that. You know it's chalk, alum, and maybe a touch of plaster. But hey, at least it's a balanced diet of carbs and construction materials. Next stop, meat pies. They smell divine, rich and savoury, like heaven in a crust, which is exactly how you know they're lying. If you were brave enough to dissect one, you'd find an assortment of animal leftovers that could legally be described as not suitable for pets, but wrapped in pastry, practically gourmet. The fishmonger shouts his wares with enthusiasm. Red herrings, smoked kippers, and of course, eels. Always eels. Steaming, jellied, writhing on the table like a nightmare you can swallow whole. These beauties come straight from the Thames, a river so polluted it recently set Parliament gagging from a quarter-mile away. Nothing says nutritious like sewage-flavoured seafood. For dessert there's fruit, bruised apples, half-fermented pears, maybe a handful of shriveled plums that died weeks ago but are still considered in season. Or you can try boiled sweets, guaranteed to rot your teeth faster than you can say, "Dentist doesn't exist for the poor." You sniff, you pay, and you bite. Because in the Victorian market, food isn't about taste. It's about rolling the dice with your digestive system and praying the undertaker doesn't get your penny next. Food for the Victorian working class was a mix of monotony and mystery. Bread was the staple, but often adulterated. Unscrupulous bakers added chalk, alum, plaster, or even ground-up bones to stretch supplies. A chemist, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, exposed these practices in the 1850s, writing, "There is no article of food more adulterated than bread." Meat was expensive, so most families rarely tasted it. When they did, it was often cheap cuts, offal, pig's trotters, ox cheek. Pies sold in the street contained whatever scraps were left over from the butcher. One 1850s Lancet investigation revealed pies filled with diseased organs. Fish was more affordable. Herring, nicknamed the poor man's staple, was eaten salted, smoked or pickled. In London, eels from the Thames were popular, until pollution turned the river into a toxic soup. Vegetables were limited depending on the season. Potatoes were common in the north, oats in Scotland, bread in the south. Fresh fruit was rare for the poor, usually purchased cheap as bruised windfalls. Street markets provided hot ready-made food: pea soup, baked potatoes, hot eels. Vendors served it in reused dishes or wrapped in old newspaper. Health standards didn't exist. A report in 1862 described soup made from bones collected from dust heaps, boiled until all that remained was grease and water. Despite the risks, these foods were affordable, filling and hot, which made them irresistible to workers living on pennies. Sugar and tea became dietary staples even during shortages. During the cotton famine of the 1860s, observers noted that families continued to buy tea, even while cutting back on bread. Tea provided comfort, caffeine, and a sense of normality in lives dominated by hardship. Nutrition, however, was poor. Rickets, scurvy, and anemia were common. Children grew up stunted with bad teeth and weak bones. And yet, some argue the Victorian diet had advantages. Bread was less refined than today. Seasonal produce retained nutrients, and even offal contained vitamins modern eaters often ignore. But mostly, food was a gamble. If it didn't kill you, it kept you going. If it did, at least the undertaker got paid. Now clutch your potato, chew your chalky bread, and pray the pie you just bought doesn't start meowing. Tomorrow leisure is over, and it's back to work. You decide to travel, a bold choice considering Victorian transport is designed less for comfort and more for testing how much suffering a body can endure. If you're broke, you walk. That means miles through mud, puddles and horse manure, with shoes that are either falling apart or non-existent. By the time you arrive, your feet are basically compost. If you've got a few pennies, you try the omnibus. It's a large wooden box on wheels pulled by horses who are as miserable as you are. Inside, it's standing room only, packed with 30 strangers who all smell like coal dust and wet wool. There's no ventilation, no suspension, and every pothole reminds you how many bones you have. If you're feeling extravagant, you take the train. First-class passengers recline on padded seats with curtains, while you, in third class, are herded into a carriage that looks suspiciously like it was designed for livestock. The floor is filthy, the benches are hard, and the air is a fog of smoke that leaves you coughing like you've swallowed a fireplace. At least the view is nice, when you can see through the soot. But the miracle of the age is speed. Journeys that once took days now take hours. True, you'll arrive smelling like a chimney, and looking like you fought a coal mine with your face, but at least you got there quickly. Victorian travel, proof that progress doesn't always come with comfort. The Victorian era transformed transportation. Before railways, most people rarely travelled far from home. Journeys were slow, expensive, and largely limited to the wealthy. By the mid-19th century, however, trains made it possible for workers to commute, families to visit relatives, and tourists to explore beyond their hometowns. Railways expanded rapidly after George Stephenson's rocket locomotive proved in 1829 that steam power was efficient. By the 1850s, Britain had a dense network of lines. For the first time, ordinary people could travel at speeds unimaginable a generation before, up to 30 miles per hour, which many worried was fast enough to make your organs explode. Spoiler, they didn't. But plenty of passengers still vomited from the smoke and jolting motion. Third-class passengers rode in open or semi-covered wagons, exposed to wind and soot. A parliamentary report in 1844 described them as little better than cattle trucks. Only after reforms were companies required to provide more humane, though still basic, accommodations. Stagecoaches and omnibuses remained common in cities. By the 1820s, London had a network of horse-drawn omnibuses, cheap enough for the lower middle class. They were crowded, slow, and often reeked of damp clothing and horse manure, but they connected neighbourhoods in ways walking alone could not. Walking was still the primary mode of transport for the poor. Many labourers trudged miles each day to factories, often barefoot or in patched boots. As one observer noted in 1840, the working man spent his life on foot, his wages too scant to afford any other conveyance. Canals and ships carried goods more than passengers, but steamships shortened travel times across the seas. A journey to New York that once took weeks could now be done in under 10 days by the late Victorian period, though steerage passengers endured conditions almost as bad as those on land. Travel then was democratised but rarely comfortable. The rich had cushioned compartments, the poor had planks, and everyone had soot. As the Times put it in 1865, the iron road brings man swiftly to his destination, though in a state little improved from his departure. So yes, trains, omnibuses and carriages opened the world, but they also made it clear that misery travels well. Now grab your ticket, cough up the soot and prepare to disembark, because next time we'll explore another defining feature of Victorian life. Workplace hazards so bad they make the train seem like a luxury spa. You wake up, stretch and head to work, which, in Victorian England, is less career and more slow-motion accident. If you're in the textile mill, your day is spent leaning into machines that could eat you faster than a sandwich. You tie threads while praying your sleeve doesn't join them. The noise is deafening, the air thick with cotton fluff, and your lungs are filing complaints by noon. If you're in the coal mine, your morning commute is crawling on hands and knees through a tunnel designed for people half your size. You haul carts of coal with a chain strapped around your waist like some kind of industrial donkey. The air is black, your candle is weak, and the mine roof looks ready to flatten you into an interesting stain. And if you're lucky enough to sweep chimneys, congratulations, you're 4 years old, naked, and shoved into a flue with soot for breakfast. If you survive, you might develop sootwort, cancer caused by living inside a fireplace for most of your childhood. Every Victorian job is dangerous. The only difference is whether you die quickly or slowly. Work in the Victorian era was as hazardous as it was unavoidable. Factories ran on long shifts, 12 to 16 hours, with little regard for worker safety. Machines had no guards, belts and gears were exposed and accidents were frequent. Reports described scalped children, mangled hands and limbs crushed by looms. The cotton mills in Manchester and Lancashire left workers with brown lung, caused by inhaling fibres. A doctor writing in The Lancet in 1863 described, "The cough of the cotton spinner is as familiar as the machinery itself." Coal mining was equally brutal. Children as young as 5 worked as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in total darkness for hours at a time. Older children hauled coal carts, sometimes crawling on all fours in water up to their waists. A royal commission in 1842 reported, "Girls of 8 and 9, blackened with coal, drag heavy corves by chains fastened about their bodies." Chimney sweeping was notorious. Boys were forced to climb narrow, soot-filled flues, often naked to scrape them clean. Many became stuck, suffocated or fell. Those who survived often developed cancers from constant exposure to soot. Public outrage led to reforms, but illegal child sweeps continued well into the century. Other jobs were hardly safer. Matchgirls worked with white phosphorus, which caused phossy jaw, a rotting of the jawbone so grotesque it glowed in the dark. Dock workers carried heavy loads with no protection. Builders worked on scaffolds without rails. Railway navvies blasted tunnels with little more than a prayer. For the poor, danger was the cost of survival. Wages were low, but hunger was lower. Families needed every penny, and workers risked their lives daily for coins barely enough to buy chalky bread and bitter tea. So yes, Victorian jobs paid in pennies and collected in blood. Now dust off the soot, cough up some cotton and head home, if you still can. Tomorrow you'll need your strength to face the one thing more exhausting than work: church on Sunday. It's Sunday. You're one day off. Naturally, that means you're working harder than ever to prove how respectable you are. First comes wardrobe. You dig out your best clothes, which are just your weekday rags with the least number of stains. If the holes are on the back, perfect. No one will see them unless you kneel too enthusiastically. The children are scrubbed to the point of bleeding and stuffed into outfits 2 sizes too small, because nothing says holiness like circulation loss. Then off you marched to church, looking like a parade of underfed scarecrows. The pews are wooden planks designed by sadists, the air is thick with damp wool, and the vicar drones on in a voice that could put caffeine to sleep. You fight to keep your eyes open, not because the sermon is riveting, it isn't, but because nodding off will earn you the death glare of Mrs. So-and-so 3 pews over. She's already made a hobby out of counting how many times your children fidget. After the service comes the Sabbath rest, which is Victorian code for sit perfectly still and don't you dare enjoy yourself. No shops, no games, no work, but also no fun. You can't whistle, you can't gamble, and if you smile too much, someone will accuse you of sinning with your face. And so you spend your one day of freedom trapped in stiff clothes, listening to lectures, pretending not to starve, and being silently judged by every person within a 5-mile radius. Congratulations, it's the Lord's Day, and you're absolutely miserable. Religion was a powerful force in Victorian life. The Church of England dominated, but Methodists, Baptists and other nonconformist groups grew rapidly, particularly among the working class. Attendance was high. By mid-century, it's estimated that more than half the population went to church weekly. Church wasn't just spiritual, it was social. For the poor, it offered charity, schooling for children, and sometimes food. For the middle class, it was about respectability. A family that went to church regularly was seen as moral, disciplined and trustworthy. Employers often judged workers based on their attendance. Sunday was strictly observed. Laws restricted trade and entertainment, making it a quiet day focused on prayer and family. Many reformers insisted the Sabbath be kept pure, free from drinking, gambling or even leisure activities. Critics joked that the Victorians had turned Sunday into the most boring day of the week. Preachers often tied morality directly to poverty. Sermons warned that drink, laziness and sin caused hardship, a convenient way to blame the poor for conditions beyond their control. As one clergyman thundered in 1851, want of bread is but the punishment of want of virtue. At the same time, churches fueled social reform. Campaigns against child labour, drunkenness and unsafe housing were often led by religious activists. Figures like Lord Shaftesbury used Christian duty to push for factory reforms and education laws. Religion also shaped gender roles. Women were praised as the moral guardians of the home, responsible for maintaining purity and piety. Men, meanwhile, were reminded that their respectability depended on keeping wives and children in line. For many, church was a lifeline. For others, it was a weekly lecture on how they were failing. Either way, it was unavoidable. As one satirical paper put it in 1879, Sunday is the day on which the working man exchanges the whip of his employer for the lash of his preacher. So yes, religion brought comfort, charity and community. It also brought sermons, guilt and rules about how loudly you could whistle on the Sabbath. Now take off your hat, bow your head, and try not to snore during the hymn. Tomorrow is Monday, and the factory whistle doesn't care how holy you were yesterday. You send the children off to school, or at least you pretend to. In reality, half of them are working, one is selling matches, and the rest are already late because you only own one pair of boots, and they have to take turns wearing them. For the lucky ones in a classroom, the day begins with 20 kids crammed into a room the size of a coal shed. The benches are so hard they could be used as weapons, and the teacher is armed with a cane, a Bible, and a personality that screams, "I peaked at age 9. Lessons are simple. Read the Bible, recite the Bible, write the Bible, and if you're really advanced, do math problems about the Bible. If you spell your own name wrong, the teacher helpfully beats the correct spelling into you. Discipline is less about education, and more about ensuring you never forget who's in charge. Playtime doesn't exist. There's drill, which means standing in rows while the teacher checks who's still alive. By the end of the day, you've learned 2 letters, a moral lesson about obedience, and the fact that school is only slightly better than crawling through a coal mine. Slightly. Victorian education was a patchwork of charity, religion and reform. Early in the century, most poor children received little to no schooling. Ragged schools, often funded by philanthropists, provided the basics, reading, writing and religious instruction, but conditions were dire. Charles Dickens described them as overcrowded rooms where dirt and ignorance are taught side by side. In 1870, the Education Act established compulsory elementary education, though compulsory was generous. Many families still kept children working in mills, mines, or workshops because wages mattered more than literacy. Inspectors reported classrooms half empty during harvest seasons as children were sent to the fields instead of lessons. Discipline was notoriously harsh. Corporal punishment was standard. Canes, rulers, and slaps across the head were common methods of encouragement. The infamous dunce cap was placed on slow learners, ensuring that struggling children received equal doses of humiliation and permanent self-loathing. Curriculum emphasized morality and religion above all else. The Bible was the central textbook, with reading lessons built around verses and arithmetic wrapped in parables. Obedience and punctuality were considered just as important as literacy, since future employers valued docile workers over clever ones. Middle and upper-class children enjoyed better schooling, with grammar schools, tutors, or boarding schools offering Latin, literature, and higher math. Girls, however, were often steered toward accomplishments, like needlework, piano playing, and how to faint gracefully in a corset. By the late 19th century, literacy rates improved dramatically, with most children able to read and write at a basic level. But the system reinforced class divides. The poor received just enough education to count change, while the wealthy got Shakespeare. As one education reformer noted in 1878, "The child of the labourer is taught to spell his master's name, but never to write his own." So yes, Victorian schooling produced a nation that could read the Bible, copy a ledger, and endure beatings with style. Now collect your child from class, check their knuckles for bruises, and be grateful. They might not be clever, but at least they can spell obey. Congratulations! You've survived bread made of plaster, water flavoured with cholera, 12-hour workdays, and sermons designed to bore you to death. Which means it's time for the last great Victorian ritual, actually dying. Your family springs into action. Curtains are drawn, mirrors are covered, and the clock is stopped. Because apparently even time itself needs to respect your dramatic exit. You're laid out in the front room, which is convenient since that's also the kitchen, the bedroom, and the nursery. Nothing bonds a family like eating supper next to a corpse. If you're wealthy, your funeral is a spectacle. Plumed horses, black draped carriages, and enough velvet to upholster Westminster Abbey. Professional mourners are hired to cry on cue, and the neighbours show up just to judge if your coffin looks more expensive than theirs. If you're poor, you get a plain pine box shared with a stranger and lowered into a hole dug by someone who charged extra to dig deeper than 3 feet. Either way, the undertaker makes a fortune. Death is the one industry that never slumps. Your widow, meanwhile, is sentenced to 2 years of mourning clothes so heavy she can barely breathe. Full mourning requires black veils, black dresses, and a personality as bright as a coal mine. If she laughs before the 2nd year is up, she risks total social exile, or worse, being called cheerful. Congratulations again. You may be gone, but your funeral is the liveliest party you'll ever throw. The Victorians turned death into an art form. Mourning customs were elaborate, especially for women. Widows were expected to wear black for 2 years. The first year in deep mourning with crepe veils and dull fabrics, the 2nd year in slightly lighter attire. Etiquette books dictated every detail, from stationery colour to the jewellery one could wear. Funerals reflected social class. The wealthy staged grand processions with hearses drawn by black horses wearing feathered plumes. Coffins were lined with velvet, and gravestones were elaborate monuments. The poor often went into debt to pay for a modest burial, leading to the rise of burial clubs and funeral insurance. Death was commercialised. Shops sold mourning clothes, accessories, and even jewellery made from the hair of the deceased. Post-mortem photography became common, with families posing for portraits with dead relatives as keepsakes. Victorian fascination with death also stemmed from high mortality rates. Epidemics, accidents, and poor health meant death was ever present. Infant and child deaths were common, and most families experienced frequent loss. Mourning rituals provided structure and a way to display grief publicly. Queen Victoria herself set the tone. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she wore black for the rest of her life. making perpetual mourning not only respectable but fashionable. As one satirical paper observed in 1876, in this age the living are poor, the dead are rich, and the undertaker is the only one smiling. So yes, in Victorian Britain death was serious business, and like everything else in the era, it was laced with rules, rituals, and just enough hypocrisy to keep everyone miserable. Now lower the coffin, dry your tears, and adjust your black veil. The Victorian age is over. You made it. Barely. And now, as the lamps are dimmed and the hearth glows with the quiet comfort of a coal fire, I hope this absurd little tour through Victorian daily life lingers, like the smell of damp wool and boiled cabbage clinging to a crowded room. You've made it through slums and sermons, soot and supper tables, endless chores, and enough rules to choke a bishop. But for now, it's time to rest. The factory whistle has gone silent, the streets have emptied, and even the rent collector has called it a night. If you're still awake. Impressive. You've just survived a bedtime walk through history's most rigid routines and relentless realities. Hit subscribe so we can peel back another layer of 19th century life tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, away from soot, sermons and supper lines, and into sleep.